Welcome back. I'm glad you're still with us. If you're just joining us, it's time for a Kickstarter discussion, and you are welcome on board. We are going to be talking currency fluctuation and the effect that has on the economy, plus a look at the fiscal space and how government is set to respond to economic shocks. This is in light of the latest development that had the ratings agency Moody placed Uganda at B3 from B2, and that has its own implications. It also helps those that make the decisions understand what they are supposed to be doing, but the concern is about Uganda's rising debt. In the last 5 years, 42.20 trillion in 2009, we shot to a staggering 93.38 as of December 2023. The Finance Ministry has talked about the need to reduce external borrowing and increase domestic borrowing at a ratio of 40:60 in the financial year 2024-2025. The budget being already out and only awaiting reading, it means many of us have already heard exactly how or seen how government will be undertaking that particular initiative. I'll be introducing my guest very shortly, but a preamble, the relationship between the exchange rate and economic development is certainly an important subject for both positive and for economists. This will be descriptive as well as normative policy prescriptions. Several developed countries that have implicitly or explicitly fixed their exchange rates to the currency of another country, say the US dollar, as Uganda does, and whose inflation rates are higher than that of the foreign country, and that is the United States in our context, often experience persistent current account deficits and eventual devaluations of currency. The fact that as we speak, the dollar continues to fight, well, not for its life, but for sustenance, is something that we need to pay attention to. On Monday evening, commercial banks quoted the shilling at 3,782 over 3,792 compared to Friday's close of 3,775 over 3,785. In a statement, of course, that was issued by the Bank of Uganda in light of the central bank rate, which is now at 10%, it indicates that efforts are underway to ensure that some of the problems that the economy is facing are taken care of. There's a lot to chew on with regard to that, but of course the latest development by Moody Ratings is one that calls for attention to debt affordability as well as sustainability. I have with me the Executive Director at the Federation of Small and Medium Enterprises, John Walgembe. He'll be helping us understand where we stand, but most importantly, how we should be moving forward. He's a man that understands what the economy is up to because he is right in the thick and thin of it. Welcome to the program, Mr. Walgembe.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to join you this morning.
How is the economy your end?
That's a tough question. I would say that the economy is going through some challenges. They are not very significant, but they are worrying. And they are
not very significant,
yes,
but they are
worrying.
They are
worrying, yes.
Okay.
We don't want to be alarmists. And
You're right, no doubt.
Yes, but we just want to tell people that we are concerned about certain developments. One, which we've just mentioned, Moody's credit rating has downgraded us from B3 to B2. For those who may not understand, these agencies that do credit rating are giving an idea of credit quality. You know? When people are choosing whether or not to lend you money, they look at this. They are trying to assess your ability to pay them on time and the overall status of your debt. I mean, it's just like if you go to a bank, they score you, they have metrics for assessing credit worthiness. There are people who go into the bank and get money within a day. Then there are people who take
months.
a year. They are trying to verify who is your wife, where was she born, and so on, because they don't trust you. And I think as a country, we are increasingly becoming that borrower.
The trust deficit is huge.
Where there's a trust deficit. And Moody's raised a number of issues. Moody's raised the issue of debt sustainability, which we have been mentioning to government severally. They also mentioned the issue of limited financing options. And they mentioned the fact that government is increasingly relying on costly domestic borrowing and less so on concessional lenders.
Yeah.
So the challenge with that is that, and indeed the portion of public debt that is dependent now on non-concessional loans has risen to about 26.7%. Moody's also raised the aspect of the suspension of New World Bank project approvals because of the passage of the Anti-Homosexuality Act. So this is still part of what I can say the ramifications of the passing of this law. They are coming in slowly but surely, and they'll negatively impact on our ability as a country to grow. Now, Moody's also made some recommendations, and the major one was that government needs to ensure that they gradually improve domestic revenue mobilization, and this is where IFRIS comes in.
Yeah,
because IFRIS now,
of course, those efforts have been there.
Yeah, so IFRIS now is meant to ensure that government is able to collect more revenue domestically, particularly the value through value-added tax. So these are the key issues that have been raised, and apart from Moody's downgrading, we've also had Parliament approve the budget recently. You know, the budgeting process is a long one. It starts in September, and it goes through several stages. And in those stages end with the approval of the budget. So government starts by setting what they call a macroeconomic framework. It sets the national priorities and what they call a budget ceiling. We go into budget consultations. Government prepares budget estimates. The budget is presented and approved, and then it's implemented. Now, unfortunately this time, government had indicated that the resource envelope is around 48.4 trillion through this entire process. And then at the end, when we're reaching the approval stage, Parliament met from 10 a.m. to about midnight. And then government introduced a corrigenda, said, sorry, we have forgotten something, and then brought an extra 14 trillion. And as you can imagine, members of Parliament were tired. Some of them may have been dozing, for instance. The ability to scrutinize and go through these documents at the last minute was not there. So we are concerned that this, and the ministry has indicated what the priorities are for this extra money. This extra money will be used to pay BOU, about 9.1 trillion. Government is going to, some of the money will go towards elections. Some of it will go towards fighting the foot and mouth disease. Some of it will go towards renewing the national ID, the oil and gas sector, AFCON, and so on. But our biggest question is that how we understand, we appreciate the priorities, but where is the money to finance them going to come from? And this is where we want to start warning the private sector that things might be get from bad to worse, because now the target that URA has to collect has risen to 32 trillion. So it means that now URA is going to be aggressive because it seeks to ensure that it collects most of this money domestically. So those are the key happenings in the economy. But our concern is really around external debt, public debt. How do we manage it? And how do we manage our expenditure as a country? Government had mooted the idea of rationalization of government agencies. This has found difficulties in Parliament, whether it's deliberate. We even heard that there's a bit of corruption. Some agencies are...
reports of some agencies working under the table to ensure they stay.
I mean, obviously, if you're an agency, if you're the head of an agency and you're earning 40 million or 50 million, you do everything in your power. It's human, and it shouldn't. It's not totally unexpected. So what we see is that the rationalization process is not moving as smoothly as we would have. But also, I'm surprised that we are only making a saving of 1 trillion shillings through this process.
On this
I think we can.
process, so
my view is that
really
we can actually save more You know, if we really
streamline,
we can streamline
how work is done.
Because my issue is that it appears that the agencies are being retained, they are just being merged. So the employees are staying, but they are simply saying, instead of belonging to UNRWA, now you belong to Ministry of Works. The pay remains the same, the benefits. So that really
they may be taking you from a bigger cubicle to a smaller one, but you retain the job. No,
everything remains the same. Okay. So it means we are defeating the purpose.
All right, that's on the part of government's efforts to ensure that some of these aspects that have been raised by the credit agency Moody and any other economic actors who are observing Uganda from a vantage point on the international community have done. But when it comes to the limiting of Uganda's fiscal space, the rating indicates that we might not be able to respond to future shocks. And given the volatility within the global economy, you cannot actually know what is going to happen in the next few months and the severity of how it rolls out. COVID was one thing that showed us that something can happen and completely topples everyone. And then after that, Ukraine happened and the global supply chain was completely disrupted. And now we have issues happening within the Middle East that are also impacting on the prices of oil, but most importantly, the movement of international goods across these waterways, and it impacts on trade across other areas. So what kind of message or how should the policymakers go about working around the latest development as written or as offered to us by Moody? Is it a case of a statement that will come out, somebody trying to tell Moody how to do its job?
No, you can't tell.
You know?
No, they can downgrade the US, they can downgrade South Africa, so I think Uganda really can't. So.
The reason I'm saying that, there has been a history of government officials responding by advising those that are advising them. Yes, how to look at us. For example, one would say, we are managing the economy our way. How dare you tell us that this is not working? We know what is working.
No, I don't think
it's not working.
I think we have to also accept advice because these are different entities that are raising this issue of debt sustainability. Bank of Uganda itself mentioned that about 35% of our GDP is going towards external debt financing. This is huge. It means that you have less space, what they call a fiscal space, to invest in social services, in education, in health, and to respond to emergencies as and when they arise. This is coupled with a drop in aid, budget support, and development assistance. Of course, the most prominent one is from the World Bank, but overall, this development aid has dropped from about 2.781 trillion to about 28.94 billion. So it's huge. And this is also made worse by fluctuation in global interest rates and exchange rates, among others. So we are on a path of a potential sovereign debt default. And as a country, we need to look at what others have gone through. Of course, Uganda is not isolated in this. Zambia has been struggling with the debt crisis, and the IMF has come through with a package, and normally the IMF comes with a lot of instruction, like a doctor that really comes and he's not even begging you now, instructing you, no, remove this, remove that, remove that. So as a country, we want to avoid getting into this scenario or nearing sovereign debt default. Kenya has also struggled, but thankfully the IMF has also come through for them. But we shouldn't wait for the IMF to come through. We should put our house in order.
Okay, talking of putting our house in order, in March, there was the release of what appeared to be a plan of action on debt management and strategy. And it entailed managing by borrowing, effectively managing borrowing costs and risks by determining appropriate balance between domestic and external borrowing. I don't know what is meant by determining balance between domestic and external borrowing when there is a consistent inability to ensure that external borrowing is minimized, yet we do not have the leverage to get as much revenue as we need from the current tax administration framework.
Okay, so the Auditor General released the report, and yesterday, you know, there's an advantage. Our Ministry of Finance is one of the most transparent.
Are you sure?
Yes, it is. If you go to their website, most things are there. The debt sustainability strategy is there.
The website looks impressive.
No,
is that anything to go by?
It's on the website being impressive. It's the amount of information you can get
what's the benchmark?
on how the economy is running.
What is the benchmark? When you say our Ministry of Finance is one of the most effective, what are you using to benchmark?
No, I mean, if you look at other African countries, I mean, that's widely acknowledged. It's just like our Bureau of Statistics, by the way. And I wonder why they bungled up the census. But they are one of the most efficient. They're one of the most efficient.
Just after you've given them credit.
So,
all right.
The Ministry of Finance is one of the most transparent.
I hope it doesn't bungle up anything.
We have to give it to them. So that makes it difficult for them in the sense that they cannot cook their own figures. Because once you put the figures out there, then people will work with what you've put out. So the Auditor General put out a report at the end of December and said that our public debt stock now stands at 96.1 trillion shillings. 44.6 trillion is domestic debt, 52.8 is debt from foreign sources. And he mentioned what I've just mentioned, that we run a risk of a sovereign debt default. Now we are going to borrow maybe 10 to 11 trillion shillings more from the domestic market. And our concern is not even the amount. First of all, we are concerned about the overall scale of public debt, but we're also concerned about the sources and the interest rates we have to pay. The challenge we have here is that most of our debt is being contracted from commercial sources, which are non-concessional. So it means our interest payments are huge. They are now taking up a huge portion of our budget and domestic revenue. So this is our concern, and we are, government itself, through the Public Finance Management Act of 2015, had made certain commitments, in this regard. They are talked about only contracting debt that is sustainable. If you look at government's own domestic revenue mobilization strategy, it mentions these things. Now, the challenge I find, and Chris, this is something that is very interesting. When you read government documents, they actually say the right things. You see? So they say, for instance, maintenance of prudent and sustainable levels of public debt. No one can argue with this statement.
Statements are really...
It's what I'm saying right now.
They're really good. Now,
government, so it means government... So it means government knows what to do. You're not telling them anything.
Now, for example, listen to this.
Yes.
The plan that is available anticipates a gradual decrease in domestic borrowing by reducing the net domestic financing. Yes. This blend is intended to progressively integrate alternative financing in the fulfillment of the provisions of the public investment financing strategy. Amidst all this eloquence in explaining how to deal with these economic
using very difficult
big words, we have the reality on the ground.
No, that's not what's happening.
Government is going into the domestic market
and
borrowing money.
Sometimes
it makes the commercial banks look at government as the best person.
Don't look. It's what it is, because government is a sovereign borrower.
Yeah, that's right.
They cannot lend to an SME.
Credit to the private sector is constrained.
No, they can't lend to an
Yet
SME.
the private sector would again have to pay taxes to the government.
Yeah,
and at the end of the day, these grand words turn out to be mere
and this is our
service.
concern, actually, that on one hand, the documents are saying the right things: maintenance of prudent and sustainable levels of public debt, maintenance of fiscal risks in a prudent manner. But the practice is different. You know that before the financial year, they recently passed a supplementary budget, and the supplementary budget was to build a stadium for AFCON, which is a good thing, but this is something that has to be planned. There's no way it can come through a supplementary budget.
It's a sentimental investment.
No, we are not opposed to the nature of investment. We are opposed to the method of financing the investment, and the way of going about it. The Public Finance Management Act talks about a contingencies fund. Okay? So they are saying, don't bring supplementary budget. Instead, create a contingencies fund. Like an individual would have an emergency fund. If something comes and you didn't anticipate, you rely on this. But you cannot have, now like this corrigenda to the budget. Some of the money that is there is 30 billion for chiefdoms and kingdoms. And now each traditional leader is going to be earning 60 million. Do you know what's going to happen? Everyone is going to start their own chiefdom. Why would you look for a job? Why would I wake up to work
when
in Kampala when I can go and set up my chiefdom and request government for 60 million, you see? And security guards and things like that. So some of these things that are not really urgent, I would say these are things we would have packed and looked at much later. And for some things like certain investors, for instance, because also in the core agenda, there's what they call investing in the pathogenic economy. Some gentleman is setting up a pharmaceutical industry to create vaccines or something. I don't know what. He promised us vaccines, he doesn't
have the money.
Now he wants 800 billion.
He gets a loan from bank,
so the
and then he can't go move forward.
For us, we are saying private investors have no business tapping into the public purse. If government wants to support investors, they should set up a business ideas scheme where all of us go and compete fair and square. If I think chapati is a transformational business, I create a business plan and go. And if I pitch it and it's accepted, then I get part of this money. So my view, therefore, is that some of the priorities, overall, there are things you can't avoid. You cannot avoid elections. You cannot avoid national IDs. You cannot say we are going to postpone AFCON. Oil and gas is important. But then there are those things that are not necessary. At the very least, they may not be necessary now.
Do you see a deliberate effort or a path that can be undertaken by the government right now to improve credit worthiness in the short and medium term?
Okay,
oil is a low-hanging fruit, apparently.
Well,
but it's management.
You can create what they call a Dutch disease with oil and gas.
Yeah.
Because what oil and gas can do is that can disorient the economy from those productive sectors that have been sustaining it, like agriculture and so on. And then you find that now the economy starts to rely on oil and gas, and then once the oil reserves are over, you're left
next?
Hanging. So this is also, that's why we shouldn't really focus so much on oil and gas, because we've not seen that transformational impact. If you look at Angola, for instance, they've been in a tough situation with debt because of, with oil and gas, they undertook very massive and white elephant investments. So for me, what I would say is, one, we need to improve domestic revenue mobilization, but not in a way that hurts businesses, because every time people talk about domestic revenue mobilization, they say businesses have to pay more, businesses have to pay more. No. Let us ensure that we have more people paying fair tax. If tax is unfair, it means more people avoid paying it, and then the few who are compliant bear the burden. So how do you ensure that tax is fairer and is more evenly shouldered by the taxpayers? The other point is we need to reduce our appetite for borrowing, generally speaking. As I said, we have already passed the IMF recommended 50% debt to GDP ratio. Moody's has downgraded us. Experts are warning about a potential sovereign debt default. So we need to moderate our appetite for borrowing. Thirdly, we need to ensure that even when we borrow from concessional sources. We should avoid borrowing domestically. We should avoid borrowing from commercial lenders, because ultimately this will crowd out the private sector. Then we also need to invest in what we call productive sectors. We are investing more in public administration, all these elections, IDs, all these MPs. So you find that politics generally now consumes a huge part of our budget, which is not a bad thing. It's critical, but we need to ensure that we have the right balance, that a good portion of the money goes back to support the businesses that have paid those taxes.
When it comes to decision making, especially by the policymakers, I want us to attempt to understand how the technocrats do feel when, for example, a document is brought on their desk and they are told Uganda is in real debt crisis, and if we do not do something like this, this is what's going to happen. Do you see the average policymaker developing a heat wave within his body because of that particular statistic that could be damning? For example, if somebody came to you and said, oh my God, this, Mr. Walugembe, your latest health report from the doctor indicates that you really don't have enough time. It could be 3 months, God forbid. The rush that happens to you when you get that assessment, does this happen to policymakers when they see Uganda's dire
By policymakers,
statistics?
you mean the technocrats or the politicians? Because they look at these things differently.
Now let's look at the technocrats first. The politicians, we might understand them. They don't really feel it.
The technocrats, it's not really their call, because government, once the politicians say this is our direction as a country, as your role as a technocrat is to actualize. Because you're not the leader. It's the politicians that have been elected. They are the ones that have been mandated. So once they say this is the direction, you have to follow. If you don't follow, then it means you're not doing your job.
You're not doing it.
So that's why we are saying technocrats should be apolitical. In the sense
what I mean by this is
whatever
that
comes to their table, they implement. Personally, they may have some reservations.
Yeah.
But within, it's like the army.
I want to believe that there is a bit of insulation on the part of public service and the technocrats from what the politicians may want, to the extent that if a politician who might not have a thorough understanding of the economics of the day suggests something that borders on the absurd, a technocrat
the technocrats can. Yeah, and I think this is where we missed up. You know, governments have what they call strong economic councils. People that advise the president or prime minister or whatever. So by the time a president takes a decision, they've had this detailed brief from this council. And this council can have different actors, can have people from the private sector. What we lack here, unfortunately, is this a very in-depth level of analysis, both within, because now you find that technocrats are just focused on spending money, not analyzing issues. And the PSST, I think, because he had an academic background, said this has to change, and you see more interest, at least from the Ministry of Finance, to study the issues, to understand why certain things are happening the way they are happening. Also in the private sector, we see more people engaging in strikes, and so, you know, how do we ensure that we create a mechanism where when economic issues come on table, we don't have to say we are closing our shops for decisions.
That is right.
You know? How do we ensure that through the Economic Council, traders can come and present their points of view and say, please, we don't like this because of A, B, C, D, E reason. And then the economists can also advise them that as a country, we are choosing to adopt the import substitution route. Therefore, we are giving you a window period of 6 years to transition. You know, so that it's not the president engaging the traders directly, but this council really is the place where ideas are exchanged, so that at the end of the day, policy is made when there's a certain level of agreement. And I think that is lacking, both on the public side, but also on the private side. Even the private sector is not investing enough in researching, in advocacy, in developing position papers, in engaging government. But also, technocrats and public officials do not respect people who come with documents. They respect people who close shops and say, now we have closed. Then they call an emergency meeting.
They listen to that kind of action.
Yes, but if you bring policy paper, put there, we shall review, we shall assess in the next meeting, we shall get back. So we need to have that kind of respect for this kind of analysis, because that's the only way we can tackle some of these issues.
All right, Mr. John Walugembe, many thanks for the perspective and helping us understand where we stand in light of the latest development in as far as our economy is concerned. The Moody ratings agency there downgrading Uganda to B3 from B2. That is significant, and of course cites diminished debt, affordability and increasing constraints on financing options. That will do it for the